Well, good morning. We're going to get into chapter 5 of Revelation today. And in chapter 5, we're going to focus on the scroll and the Lamb. You might recall when we moved to chapter 4, we had a change in the way John saw things. Up to chapter 4, through chapter 3, up to chapter 4, John's vision generally takes place on the island of Patmos. Here, and beginning in chapter 4, actually, we did begin in chapter 4, that point of view changed in chapter 4, and we'll be in the same place in chapter 5, and actually throughout the rest of the book of Revelation. In chapter 4, we move to John's perspective, being from the heavenly throne room. And we talked about the heavenly throne room and what was involved there, and we're first introduced to the Lamb there. And now in chapter 5, which is a continuation of the same vision, we're going to deal specifically with the scroll and the Lamb. And if we finish chapter 5 and time still permitting, what we're likely to do is move into something that I would call an excursus. In other words, we're not going to move directly into chapter 6. Instead, we're going to take a side view, an excursion into what the period of tribulation was. And the period of tribulation, which, by the way, is never mentioned. Well, tribulation is mentioned, but the duration of tribulation is not mentioned in Revelation. We're going to find that in Daniel. So we're going to go back and look at Daniel and talk about that period of time, because most people would put the period of tribulation beginning in chapter 6 of the book. So before we get into the chapter, we'll take this excursion and go back and look at what exactly it meant when we were talking about, or means when we're talking about this period of tribulation. So let's start back in chapter 5. In chapter 5, there's kind of a center of gravity which lies in the three hymns that we'll see in verses 9, 12, and 13 that focus on the Lamb in the first two hymns, and then God and the Lamb in the last. The singers of the hymns get progressively greater. 24 elders, angels, numbered thousands upon thousands, the creatures. So it's going to get to be a cacophony of sound as we get to the end of chapter 5. Now, the focus of this entire chapter is on the Lamb being the only one worthy in all creation to take the scroll from the one who's seated on the throne. So let's start that, chapter 5. And we'll read a few verses. We're not going to read everything in chapter 5. We'll come back to pieces of it. But in the first few verses, we're going to get the setting and what's related to the scroll and the Lamb. So let's just read, let's call it down through verse 5. So starting in Revelation 5, verse 1, "Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll, with the writing on both sides, and sealed with the 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?' But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it. I wept and wept, because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or look inside. Then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals.'" First of all, this scroll and the 7 seals, you'll notice it can't be read until all the seals have been broken. In ancient times, it was not uncommon for a king or a writer of any scroll to roll the scroll and seal it with a signet ring or some method of letting people know that the scroll had been sealed and was intended only to be opened by that who should be the reader. So this scroll had 7 seals. And I think we can actually get a pretty good view of that. Let's see if we've got, this should be, let's see, this will be your slide 17, the 7-sealed scroll. And it's going to deal with chapters 6 and 7 more than anything else, but we're introduced to the scroll here, and you can see the seals on the scroll itself. The scroll can't be read until all 7 seals are broken. Now, there are a number of good theologians who've made the case over the years that the scroll is actually the scroll that's introduced in Daniel chapter 12. If we get to the end of Daniel in chapter 12, in fact, chapters 6 through 12 are all prophecy of end times or what's coming. Up through chapter 6 in Daniel, it's basically a historical view. Once we get to chapter 6 and through chapter 12, it's going to be prophecy of what's going to happen in the future. Interestingly enough, excuse me, in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not included in the prophets as it is in Christian Bibles. It's included in historical books. It's included part of the writings as a historical book. In this case, though, and from, as I said, chapter 6 through chapter 12, is clearly prophetic about what to expect in future times. So let me go back to chapter 12 of Daniel. If you want to turn there with me, I want to read just these first 4 verses, and then I'm going to skip to a verse, and we'll come back and make a point about it. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress. By the way, that term distress, if we were reading this in Greek, would be thlipsis, which is rendered tribulation, such as not has been happened before from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Now, there's one other verse that refers to this, and it's also in chapter 12. Jump to verse, I'll call it 8 with me, 8, 9. He replied, start in verse 8, I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will be the outcome of all this? He replied, go your way, Daniel, because the words are closed up and sealed until the end of time. Both times, that term, the end of time, and as we've talked about before, that kind of terminology is usually related to what's called eschatology, and that is the study of last times, or the study of last things. So many believe we're talking about the same scroll, that this is actually Daniel's scroll that is shared with him by the archangel Michael. And Michael says, now seal up everything that you have here until some time at the end. And the end is going to be when the end of time comes, or at least that's what most theologians who relate the two scrolls say. Did want to do one short aside here. Of all the angels mentioned in the Bible, only 2 are named, Gabriel and Michael. Interestingly, in Daniel, and I think this may be the only place they are named together, in Daniel chapter 10, verse 21, both of them are named, both Gabriel and Michael. So here we have Michael saying to Daniel, seal up this scroll until the time of the end. Now, let's go back to Revelation and look at the next couple of verses. And I want to point a couple of things out. So go back with me to chapter 5, and let's look at verses 2 through 4 in a little more detail. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, "Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?" But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside. I wept and wept because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or look inside. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." So in verses 2 through 4, no creature in all of creation was found worthy to open the seals on the scroll. And then in verses 5 and 6, we see the consummation of God's twofold purpose in history. The first is to reclaim his kingdom and to redeem his people. The twofold victory over Satan is first predicted in Genesis 3:15, first to reclaim his kingdom, and secondly to redeem his people. The twofold purpose is found first in Genesis 3:15, and then covenanted in the covenant with Abraham in the promise of the land and a seed. So we get to the point then that we find there's no one able to open this scroll until we get to this one that's described as the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the Root of David. Both of these are messianic terms. First of all, let's talk about the Lion of the tribe of Judah. If you go to Genesis 49, you're going to find Jacob, Israel, is about to die, and he gives a blessing to each of his sons. Now, if you read through it, you're going to say, well, boy, some of these don't really sound like blessings. But when he gets to Judah, he calls him. He says, you are like a lion's cub. He says, you are the lion. So all the way back in Genesis, as early as the first book of the Bible, we already have reference to the Messiah, the coming Messiah, as being the lion of the tribe of Judah. And then it goes on to say, in the Root of David. As both are messianic titles, the Root of David, we're going to find, you can find in Isaiah 11:1 and 10. The Root of David is going to be in the house of David, King David. This is the only one who will be able to prevail. And prevail here refers to death and resurrection of Christ on behalf of those who are going to be redeemed. In fact, we'll spend some time with it here in just a minute on the whole issue of the Lamb, which we get to in verse 6. It says, the Lamb had been slain. Well, we know who that is. By virtue of being able to look backward and see what all the Bible says, we know that that's Christ, whom John the Baptist, you might recall, calls the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's in the very first chapter of the Gospel of John when he's talking about John the Baptist. Now, how striking that Christ's worthiness is seen by John more in terms of a lowly lamb than a regal lion. Well, the reason for that is throughout the rest of the New Testament, much of the Old Testament, the vision of the Messiah is going to be a lamb, but it's going to be in one of two veins. The term lamb here, a specific term, occurs only in Revelation, and it occurs 29 times. The one exception may be at the end of the Gospel of John. There are two terms that are used to define lamb in Greek, and the first is amnos, A-M-N-O-S. It's used figuratively of Christ as the expected one who is expected. That's used in the Old Testament and in the New Testament up to a certain point, up to the point of Revelation. There's a second word that's used for a lamb in Greek. And that word presents the completed sacrifice that has acquired dignity, majesty, honor, authority, and power. Do you understand the distinction? The distinction is, Amnos is the Lamb who is to come, who has yet to be crucified, who has yet to be resurrected. Arnion, on the other hand, is the Lamb who has been crucified, who has been resurrected, and as a result of that is now worthy to open the scrolls. So only in Revelation do we get this term Arnion used 29 times. Now, in the Bible, if we continue reading in verse 6, then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing in the center of the throne, encircled by 4 living creatures and the elders. He had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out in all the earth. He came and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. In verse 7, I think it is. Let's go to verse 7. The reception of the scroll from the Father demonstrates that judgment and authority now over all the earth is committed to the Son, to Christ. The scroll is likely the same one that was used in Daniel, as I said. But look in verse 7 with me for just a second. He came and took the scroll from the right hand of him who had sat on the throne. And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints, and they sang a new song. You'll notice here it says, he came, who is the he here? It's the Lamb, took the scroll from the right hand. The right hand is always imaged in the Bible, and certainly the Old Testament, as the hand of power, took it from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. Who is the only one that can be defined as the one sitting on the throne? That has got to be the God of the universe. So now, and when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures, so now God not only gives willingly the scroll, he anticipates the Lamb, the only one worthy, to be able to take that scroll and eventually open all the seals. And then we get to the next of the songs. They're going to be sung. Before we do that, let's look at one other issue here, and that is the bowls. Let's see. He had 7 horns, 7 eyes. God sent him out, and he came and took the scroll from his right hand and said to him, once he had taken it, 4 living creatures, they were holding golden bowls full of incense. This is not the only time we're going to see bowls full of incense. The bowls, at least the 7 bowls, here the 7 bowls are filled with incense, but we're going to see it again later on, the 7 bowls. We're going to see them later on when the golden bowls are used to hold, here they hold the prayers of the saints, but in the future they're going to be used to pour out God's wrath on the earth, which we're going to get to in the Great Tribulation up in in chapters 15 and 16. So the bowls here first represent those things, the bowls that were used to pour out the blessings. Later, it's going to be used to pour out the curses. Now, look in verse 9. And they sang a new song. The new song celebrates the redemptive work of the Son as a basis for his right to judge. So Christ is worthy to open the scroll because he was slain. So verse 9 again, and they sang a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals because you were slain. So Christ is the only one found worthy in all the universe to take the scroll and to open the seals because he was slain on the cross, purchasing with his blood believers out of every nation. Note the first song sung. In the first song sung, there are only 24 elders and the 4 living creatures. As we move on, I want you to notice how big the choir gets. But first, let's look at verse 10. You have made them to be a kingdom of priests and to serve our God, and they will reign on earth. Reign on earth is most likely the future after tribulation during the millennial reign. In chapter 20, we'll talk about that. But there are a number of times when we are told that the believers, Christians, are going to reign with Christ. It's implicit in the 1,000-year period. It's implicit, but we're told in a number of occasions we will reign. And then look at one other thing in the last part of this chapter, and then I want to move on to what I termed our excursus. Then I looked in verse 11, then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders. In a loud voice they sang, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise." Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them, singing, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever." Last week Bob asked the question about, when we first started talking about who was singing here, he said, well, who is it? Is it the creatures we learned about in chapter 4? Is it the angels? Who is it? And the answer is yes. Yes to all of these. And probably the best analogy that we had was one we used last week, which is, we're getting into the finals of basketball season, certainly in college basketball, but we're probably another 3 months before we'll be into NBA basketball. I'm not a big NBA fan, but if you were to be watching a Nuggets basketball game, and first of all, I don't know why anybody would want to watch the Nuggets, but at any rate, if you were to watch a Nuggets basketball game, here's what you'd see. You would see the 10 players on the floor and the officials. They would be the focus of attention, and much would be going on there. But around the outside, around the periphery, you're going to see other coaches and players and other supporters around the periphery. As you move up a little further in the stands, you're going to see more and more people. And if you were me and you did want to go see one of these games, there's no question that you'd be buying a cheap ticket, so you'd be way up in the rafters someplace. Picture this entire stadium focused on what's going on the floor, and you'll have a pretty good picture of what is trying to be represented here. Obviously, the difference is we eventually get to where it's not just the beast, not just the elders, not just the angels, but everyone throughout the world focused on what's happening. All of them point to this creature. So in verses 13 and 14, the loud sevenfold praise for the Lamb spills over from the heavenly throne room, is joined by every creature on the earth, under the earth, in the sea. Blessing and honor and power and glory. From the vantage point of heaven, these verses look forward to the climactic point when every tongue should confess that Jesus is Lord. And that's in Philippians 2. I want you to notice that it says every tongue. That means believers, non-believers, at some point all are going to have to bend the knee to the one who is Christ. Some to, as Daniel pointed out, some to everlasting glory, some to everlasting perdition. So that kind of summarizes in a few verses what chapter 5 has to offer us. And the focus there has been the scroll, which we talked about, and the Lamb, the only one the only one who can open the seals on the scroll, because he was the only one that was perfect. Now, let's move to our excursus. We're going to go to chapter 6, but we're going to do this bit of an excursus just to discuss this tribulation period, which is a confusing concept and a confusing period of time. And to do that, we're going to look at Daniel's 70 weeks. We'll go look at a few verses related to that here in just a minute. I do have to tell you that This is unquestionably one of the most controversial passages of the Bible, and you'll get innumerable takes on what people think this passage is saying. If you're a preterist, you're going to say, in other words, somebody who believes all of this was fulfilled up to by 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, you're going to have a view of it. Others will have different views of it. We will continue to take a futurist view, saying that Daniel chapter 9 is going to be, while it can have short-term fulfillment, don't forget we've talked about fulfillment of prophecy in the Bible, often has both short-term fulfillment and long-term fulfillment. And the analogy I've used is if you go out and look up Maine or look towards the San Juans, you see mountains. Right now they're snow-capped, and the appearance is that it's just one view. They're all right there. But in reality, if you were to fly over it, if you were to drive over it, what you'd see is there are some closer, some further, some even further back. So prophecy can often have both a near-term fulfillment as well as a long-term fulfillment. Since we're looking at this primarily as futurists, when we look at Revelation, we're going to look at it in terms of long-term fulfillment. Now, our excursus. Well, first of all, what's an excursus? An excursus comes from a Latin word, probably has its origin in Greek, that means to extend, to run out, or to sally forth. In other words, it's going to take a certain subject and extend it further. So we're going to look at this excursus, this subject matter, as it relates to the book of Revelation, but specifically focus on what it's telling us about this period of time. Most theologians will point to either chapter 4 or to chapter 6 as beginning the period of tribulation. Chapter 4, you could make a case for chapter 4, but I think more likely what we're seeing in chapters 4 and 5 is the setting of the stage. In other words, John's moving from Patmos, not moving literally, but his vision moving from the island of Patmos now to this heavenly throne room where he's going to be able to watch everything else. And in chapter 4, we talked about the heavenly throne room, and in chapter 5, we talked about the Lamb and the scroll, but we have yet really to get into what any of that means, other than knowing that it's somehow related to the tribulation period. So, it's more likely that chapter 6 is going to begin to introduce our period of tribulation in Revelation. Now, and we'll also come back a little bit into chapter 24 of Matthew, which we've talked about being what's called the Olivet Discourse. That's Jesus in his discourse telling us what end times are going to look like. So we'll come back and forth between those two. But first, I want to start with Daniel 9, and we're going to be in verses 24 to 27. This is where we're first introduced to this concept called the tribulation. First of all, we need to go back just a few verses to verse 21 of chapter 9 of Daniel and find out who's doing the talking here. While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and said to me, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, an answer was given, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the message and understand this vision. Now, this is Gabriel who's about to talk here. He says, 70 sevens are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. In verse 25, know and understand this, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and the desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed and poured out on him. Now, let's dissect because there's a lot of stuff here, but let's dissect what all of this means. Now, first of all, some of your versions, when we first started reading, may have said, well, wait just a minute. Mine says weeks. And the NIV in verse 24 says 77s. In the King James, probably the New King James, some of the more literal translation is likely to say weeks. The reality is the word that's used, the Hebrew word that is used, is an indefinite period of time. Usually, in this case, it would be 7. So when it says 7 weeks, it means for a period of sevens. So 7 sevens. Almost all theologians agree that these are periods of 7 years. So 7 sevens is going to be 49 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and it comes from the word, by the way, the term that's used comes from the word Shiva, which in Hebrew means 7. So don't get too caught up in the weeks and try to make the weeks work, because they're not going to work. The sevens will work, sevens in terms of a year's period of time. Now, first let's look at the purpose of 70 weeks. Why is there even a 70-week period? Now, the prophecy contains a statement concerning God's sixfold purpose in bringing these events to pass. And you'll find them in the very first verse, in verse 24. Notice what it says. Verse 24 says this purpose is, 1, to finish transgression. 2, to put an end to sin. 3, to atone for wickedness. Now, I'm going to say right now, stop, break, hold things right there. I'm going to read the rest of them to you, and I'll come back and say why I said that. 4, to bring in everlasting righteousness. 5, to seal up vision and prophecy. And 6, to anoint the most holy. A minute ago, I might have said there are 7. They're not. There are 6. The first 3 and then the last 3. And you remember when I said break? Well, the reason for saying that is this. Notice the first 3. To finish transgression. To put an end to sin. To atone for wickedness. Have those happen? They have. All of those occurred at the crucifixion. To finish transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for the wickedness of the people. Now, did Christ put an end to sin? He did not, but what he did do is provide a method for atonement, for a method for forgiveness of sin from a holy God. So in effect, he brought an end to sin for those who believe in him and believe in his sacrifice and believe in his Father. And he obviously atoned for the wickedness that was established all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 and put an end to transgression. So all of those things we can say were accomplished at the foot of the cross. Now, let's move on though and look at the next 3. To bring in everlasting righteousness. Do we have everlasting righteousness today? Boy, you'd have a tough case of making that, wouldn't you? So that cannot have been something that was completed. It has to be something that will happen in the future. To seal, and the 5th one, to seal up vision and prophecy. What does that mean? At some point, there will be no need for prophecy, correct? I believe there's still prophecy today. I believe there's been prophecy since the time of Christ, and there will continue to be prophecy. And remember, don't get too hung up on the word prophecy in terms of foretelling the future or foreseeing the future, because prophecy really has two pieces to its definition. The first of those is forthtelling. The second is foretelling. I want to distinguish between those two because it's important. Every prophet, I think there are three exceptions, one of which is Daniel, interestingly enough, begins their prophecy by saying, this is the word of the Lord that was given to the prophet by such and such and such. That's proclamation. That is proclaiming who God is and proclaiming who, in New Testament times, who Jesus is. That is forthtelling, telling or preaching the gospel. Now, what about foretelling? Foretelling is more like what we would see as the prophecy. In 3 days, or in 2 days, I guess now, I prophesy that San Diego State's going to win the Final Four. I have no idea whether that'll occur. That's foretelling the future. By the way, if a prophet a prophet's prophecy never came true, did not come true, the Bible tells us he's to be stoned. So I'm certainly hoping that the San Diego State wins, because otherwise I'm going to be in big trouble. But you understand the distinction. In prophecy, there is forthtelling and foretelling. Is there prophecy today? Yes, there is. Has there been prophecy since the time of Christ? Yes, there has been. Will there be prophecy into the future? Yes, there will, until the time comes to seal up vision and prophecy. And why would that be? There's no longer going to be a need for prophecy, because we're going to be in the millennial age and then the perfect kingdom. And then finally, the last one is to anoint the most holy. Now, there's a couple of ways of looking at that. The most holy being Jesus, or the most holy being the most holy place in a future temple, which is not going to be built, I don't believe, in our lifetimes. It's not going to be built, and I believe, on the Dome of the Rock. I believe it's a future temple that will be rebuilt, and it will be rebuilt during the millennial period. So I don't want to make too big a deal of this, but the 6 points that John brings up, the sixfold purpose, actually John's simply writing it, it's the angel Gabriel who's telling us this, are these: to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to finish transgression. All of that happened at the cross. To seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy, and to bring in everlasting righteousness. All of that is yet to happen. Now, notice that these results concern the total eradication of sin and the establishing of righteousness. Now, the prophecy of the 70 weeks, 70 periods, summarizes what happened before Jesus set up his millennial kingdom. Of special note is the third in the list: to atone for wickedness. Jesus did accomplish that at the cross, and that is something that we're getting ready to celebrate as we get closer and closer to Good Friday and Easter. Now, I want to look at this period of time in kind of a graphic manner, and that is well, actually, let's look at a previous slide first, because the previous slide deals specifically with the 7 years of tribulation. And I chose this. By the way, there's a million of them you can get. I chose this slide because I think it does a very good job of connecting verses in other books of the Bible with what's going on in Daniel. You'll notice, beginning all the way on the left-hand side, we have the cross. Now, this is obviously a futurist view. Not only a futurist view, but is also someone with the view of the rapture occurring prior to tribulation. And you'll notice in where the little fish hook looking thing is. By the way, the reason that's rendered as a fish hook is nowhere in 1 Thessalonians 4 does it say Jesus comes to the earth. In fact, it says that he will come down, and then he will call others, he will call believers up to him. So nowhere in the rapture does this view of Jesus being on the ground occur. If you are a believer in pre-tribulational rapture, this is when it occurs. Notice that along our timeline here, we end up with two boxes, kind of a pinkish top and white bottom to it. This writer, and I would say it's probably an Orthodox view, or at least an evangelical view, views the first 3.5 years of tribulation as occurring in chapter 6 through 10, which is why we are going to start in chapter 6 in terms of Revelation. And then what is called a mid-tribulational view. In other words, there are 3.5 years of tribulation that are tough, but not quite as tough. What's about to follow. In mid-trib, there's going to be a period from chapters 11 to 13 that we'll look at. And then in what many people call the Great Tribulation is going to be the last 3.5 years, which are chapter 14 through chapter 19. You'll notice on the bottom, well, actually on both the bottom and the top of our timeline, we're given a number of verses that we can refer to go and make the case for this tribulation timeline. Now let's go to the second slide, which is going to will explain the 70 weeks, or the 70 periods of 7. And again, unquestionably some of the most controversial that you'll find of any of the writings are here in Daniel, and what do these periods represent? So take a look at this, and we'll start on the left-hand side, and you'll notice that it says that part of what Daniel says is that from the command or the requirement to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, when that's given, that's going to begin the timeline, or the clock, I guess you could say. And you'll notice here 444 BC is used. Well, I've heard anything from 483 to any number of possibilities here. The reason 444 is used here is because if you go to the book of Nehemiah, that's when Artaxerxes says to Nehemiah, I want you to go back, you need to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the city of Jerusalem. He's not talking about the temple. Ezra has already undertaken that, as Ezra and the first returners. He's talking about the period to rebuild Jerusalem. From that date, and the time to decree, from that date, the period is going to be 483 years. Well, what does this 444 have to do? We'll come back to that here in a minute. As I said, there's a lot of controversy about it, but many will use this 444 date as the period of time that the decree is issued. So, and by the way, you can find that in Nehemiah chapter 2, 1 through 8. You won't find the date. What you will find is the decree. If you have a study Bible, it's probably going to give you the date of when this point in King Artaxerxes' reign was. Now, you'll notice that in our first block of time, we have a kind of a long arc called the 69 weeks, and then within that we have 70 weeks, or 62 plus 62 weeks for a total of 69. Again, these are periods of 7. So the first unit of 7, the 49 years of the 7 sevens, covers the time it took to rebuild Jerusalem with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. That term trouble is thalipsis in Greek, and it would mean that during this period of time, and there was a lot of tribulation during the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple when the exiles first come back into the land. That's our first 7 sevens, or 49 years. The rebuilding is chronicled in the book of Nehemiah. Now, here's where part of our problem with dating comes from. Converting the 360-day year that's used by Jews, which is a lunar calendar, to a solar calendar makes the 483 years 476. Now, the lunar calendar had 360 days. the solar calendar 365 days. So which was it? Well, I'd like to tell you that we know beyond doubt which one it was. Unfortunately, we don't. Daniel is writing from Persia. The Persians and the Babylonians used what's called the solar calendar, 365 days out of the year. The lunar calendar used by Jews was 360 days, and it was based on the new moons. Both of them had what was called an intercalary year, where they could adjust the times so they wouldn't get so far behind. But if we adjust the calendar and adjusting from BC to AD, because there's no year, they're simply going from BC to AD. 460 years after 44 BC places us at exactly 33 AD, which you'll see here is the crucifixion. Now, again, controversy about that. Did Jesus die at 33 AD? Did he die at 30 AD? Did he die at 29 AD? I've mentioned this before, one of the things that bugs me about, I better not say bugs me about the Bible. One of the things that's difficult, maybe that's the best way to say it, about the Bible is how time is dealt with. Ezekiel is one of the few books in the Bible where you can go and pretty well do things by the date and time, because Ezekiel is very good about saying in the 400 and something year or the 20th year of somebody's reign in the month of Nisan on this date. He's very good about that. Very rarely do you find that in the Bible. In fact, most of what you find in the Bible and in Hebrew or actually in Middle Eastern time, the time was fairly amorphous. As an example, you might be reading something in your Bible, and then it says after this. After this can be a period of 2 days. It can be a period of 2 hours. It could be a period of 20 years. So the timing and calendars, those kinds of things become very difficult, especially in the New Testament, somewhat in the Old Testament. The point here is, according to the 77s, we have achieved 69 of the 77s by the time we get to the crucifixion. Now, the prophecy of Daniel, chapter 9, specifies that after the completion of these years, the anointed one will be cut off. This is fulfilled when Jesus is crucified. Daniel 9:26 continues with the prediction that after the Messiah is killed, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, who are the people of the ruler to come? Well, again, there's near-term and long-term prophecy. The near-term prophecy, most would say that would be Titus in AD 70 when he destroys all Jerusalem. The long-term prophecy, the ruler who is to come, is later going to be referred to as the Antichrist, or who many believe to be the Antichrist. That can't happen until end times. So now we have this period of our 69 weeks, and then the Messiah, the anointed one, will be cut off. And notice here that in our chart, what we have again is 2 arcs, a fairly small arc for the 37 years until Jerusalem is destroyed, and the long arc, which is done in dashes because no one knows when that's going to occur, the long arc being the church age. Now, that brings us to the final kind of piece of the puzzle here, and that is this. Okay, if we've dealt with 69 years plus, when do we get the last of the week of sevens? When do we get the last of the 7 sevens? Now, as I said, most scholars believe that we are living, in other words, we're in this seventh. We're in a period of time before the final 7 begins. Most scholars believe that we are now living in this huge gap. And if you recall our discussion on dispensationalism would say this is one of the ages of the dispensations. This is the period called the church age, which is an indefinite period of time. And we're living in that between the 69th and the 70th week. The prophetic clock has been paused, as it were. The final 7 of Daniel is what we usually call the tribulation period. Now, Daniel's prophecy reveals some of the actions of the Antichrist, the ruler who will come. In verse 27, it says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. However, in the middle of the 7, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation in the temple. Well, we've had that phrase before. We've heard about the abomination that causes desolation. In fact, it's Daniel who tells us about it. But Daniel was talking about a period in roughly 167 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes, who was one of the great-great-great-grandsons of one of Alexander the Great's generals, he storms into the temple and he desecrates the temple, and ultimately the Maccabees take over, and that's where we get our celebration of Hanukkah. That was the first abomination that causes desolation. Jesus can't possibly be talking about that, can he? Because Jesus is referring to something in the future. That happened 167 years before the birth of Christ. So that can't be it. There were other abominations in the temple. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, there are other times when there are abominations. But most likely, Jesus is referring here to what's going to happen in final times. Now, Jesus warned of this event all the way back in chapter 24 of Matthew. Now recall, we've talked about this several times, and if I were you, I'd probably write it down in my Bible someplace, because chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew, it's also found in Mark and Luke, but I think the most detailed is going to be here in Matthew. It talks about the events of what's going to happen in end times. And Jesus even says all of these will occur at some point in the future. When he says, keep your eye peeled for when the trees begin to bud, that's the beginning of this period of time. All these things are going to occur. Once they begin, they're all going to occur to this generation, meaning the generation that's there when they begin. All the way back in Matthew 24:15, I want you to listen to what Jesus says. Matthew 24:15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of the house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to for his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days. Now, just before that, let me tell you what he said about, and he started to tell the disciples who've asked about when Jesus said all these stones will be turned over. He's talking about the temple. They asked him, he said, well, when is this going to occur? And Jesus starts out in chapter 24, and he begins to tell these things. And then in the verse just before what we read, he says this, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So Jesus has got to be talking about some point in the future, because at this point, the gospel has not been heard in all the nations. We're going to come back in a little bit and kind of tag on to our excursus with a discussion of the 1040 window. He's got to be talking about some point in the future. Now, after the Antichrist breaks the covenant with Israel, a time of great tribulation, he talks about a time of great tribulation in Matthew 24:21. And here's what he says. For then there will be a great distress, tribulation, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. In those days, he can only be talking about some point in the future. Now, let's see. Why don't we stop our discussion of, we'll come back and revisit this a little bit, but I thought it was important for you to understand where this concept of the tribulation comes and how Daniel's 70 weeks or 77s occur. Now, just a minute ago, I referred to coming back to revisit something. I want to revisit two things that we've talked about in the past. somewhat germane to our discussion of Revelation, but more importantly, just things that we've discussed in the past that I wanted to revisit just to kind of remind people. And the first one is this. When we were talking about when will the gospel be heard throughout the world, we talked about something called the 1040 window. So the slide you see in front of you is called the 1040 window, and you can probably recognize here the map extending from all the way from North Africa, kind of a belt all the way to India and points further east. The reason it's called the 1040 window is because it exists from 10 degrees south parallel to 40 degrees north, in other words, south latitude to north latitude. That's the window, geographic window, and from northern Africa all the way to India. In that window, 2/3 of the world's population, in other words, 4 billion people, live in that window. 95% of those 4 billion are unevangelized. And if you can see it down at the bottom of the chart, I'll try to read it off to you. These are the darkest red are Muslim. They're Muslim. Hindu is the blue or green, I think it is. Buddhists, these are other religions currently unevangelized. Now, it also includes 87% of the poorest of the poor, living on an average of only about $250 per family annually. I want you to think about that. You can spend that much money in Starbucks anymore, but $250 annually for the families that live in this window. In many of there are 69 nations represented here. In many of the 69 nations, witnessing the Christian gospel is illegal and will result in imprisonment or death. I gave you the citation at the bottom of the slide there. It's called the 1040 Window International Network. The Joshua Project has also done a lot of work on this concept called the 1040 window. But the concept is there is still much of the world to be evangelized. So that's one of the slides I want to spend a little bit more time with. And then last week we talked about something called the Bible Rainbow. Please, please, please don't think that's the name of what this is. That's my name for it. I named it the Bible Rainbow because it looks like a rainbow. I think it's a beautiful design here. But what it really is that Chris Harrison, who's mentioned here, and I also put his website on the slide. If you get a chance, you want to go visit his website. It's Chris Harrison who did this. Chris Harrison and a partner whose name I don't recall. They had built a database of all of the verses throughout the Bible that can be found in one book and then later referenced in another book, or in a book in the future referencing back to another verse in the past. And they linked all those together in this database. But they thought, well, now how can we possibly use this so that people can understand the impact of what this means? Because what they did was they found almost 64,000 cross-references in the Bible that might say, as an example, when Jesus says to the devil, "Get away from me," when the devil tries to tempt him right after his baptism, 3 different times he quotes Deuteronomy. Well, that would be one of these linkages, and the linkage would be from Matthew to Deuteronomy, this cross-reference. So that's what this represents, 64,000 cross-references from book to book. If you took the longest arc, the one all the way on the left, and drew it all the way over to the one on the right, you would find some reference in Genesis to Revelation and some reference in Revelation to Genesis. So that's how this works. And one last piece of the puzzle, if you look along the bottom part of our rainbow here, the horizontal line, you'll see some kind of white blobs and then some gray blobs and then some grayer blobs and then white blobs again. Well, what that represents, each of those blobs represent a book of the Bible, and each one of the lines within that blob represents the chapter. So the very first line you see is going to be Genesis 1:1. The very last line you're going to see is going to be Revelation 22, whatever the last verse is. And the parallels, or these lines, are drawn between all of those. The longest line, the one right smack dab in the middle, you've probably already recognized as Psalm 119, which is the longest book and the longest chapter anyhow, of the Bible. Now, why would I bring all this up? Well, first of all, we've gone back and forth from Revelation to Daniel to Matthew and finding those connections throughout. We'd probably find a whole bunch of them here if we could just blow up the chart just a little bit. So the important part about this is twofold. First of all, we have these connections in every one of the books to other books, maybe not every one of the books, but to other books throughout the Bible, 64,000 of them. Here's the bigger issue. What does that mean? It can only mean there's only one author. Who else would have the ability to tell a story of 66 books, 40 writers, over 4,000, 5,000, 6, however many thousand years of time, except one author? And that's God Almighty. So let's stop there today. We'll come back next week and deal with chapter 6, when we'll begin the period of tribulation in earnest, and we'll deal with a couple of important issues. Probably the most important, or certainly not the most important, the ones that are most famous are the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So we'll end today, come back next week, and open the Bible to chapter 6 of Revelation.